So I'm going to ask a question, kind of a generic one or an observation and a question. And I'm getting back to my theme that I used on the on another panel is what's the worst case scenario? And what I would say is, and it just all aligns with what was said before, is that, you know, in the last, say, 20, 30 years, it seems like the battleground on higher ed budgets and things have been at the state level. And we've had some levels of stability for a long time on the federal side. And now we have two fronts. We have a battle on two fronts to some degree. But the other kind of stealth threat in this scenario is that the tax cuts that are being proposed by the Republicans, a lot of this is around pushing costs to the states. So, you know, say we get a sneak bill in there to further erode the Obamacare. We have these kind of things about pushing costs to the states. And so the question would be naturally is, well, we're going to have this two-front battle perhaps as we go into the next year about the money, is, you know, do states have the capacity to take on the kind of additional costs that could be pushed on them for Medicare and other things, and then have room to do anything about higher ed? So that seems like one really bad scenario. Do you want to comment on whether that's something that could happen, or you don't think it'll happen? Go ahead, Henry.
Well, so far they have not been able to repeal Obamacare, but if they repealed the parts that provided for Medicaid funding and sent that back to the states, depends on what they did exactly, but that could be a $6 to $20 billion impact, for example, on the state of California. And remember that we're, about $3 or $4 billion of the budget for UC right now, and it's a total general fund budget of about $115 billion. So that kind of hit on the California budget would further crowd out, as healthcare funding has crowded out historically higher education funding, and it would do it not just in California but across the nation, especially for those states who took on Obamacare. So the net result could be devastating. It looks like that's not going to happen, thank goodness.
Now, one thing that I think is apparently going to happen is the elimination of the federal tax deduction for state and local taxes paid. And that is, in effect, a tax on liberal states. Right. It's states that have higher tax rates in California, New York, Connecticut, et cetera, Massachusetts. It's in effect a tax increase on us, which means our capacity to counter with our budgets anything that's happening at the federal level is reduced in that way. So kind of an indirect hit on costs.
So to be positive, two countervailing forces is to say there are significant business interests who want to have both funding at the federal level in health and in science, and then also to have higher education be able to train people in order for them to have workers. And so I think there are strong lobbies to keep that from happening. But the other example, if you remember the stem cell research issue, California is big enough that when the federal government decided not to allow funding for that, we funded it through a ballot initiative, and that's why we have this fancy building on Oxford. So, you know, there are other ways, I think, if we don't have the other countervailing budget costs, that California is big enough to perhaps make up some of that difference for specific areas of research.
Nonetheless, I think that anything that forces a large amount of federal burden back on the states is going to constrain the rest of the budget. And again, we have starved the beast in a different way. Right. It will negatively affect.
And we shouldn't forget what it was like in California in 2009 when we didn't have a state budget. There was no money in the state budget, and we're doing okay right now just because the economy is strong. But that's going to end at some point.
Well, so another thing, at least an observation, is that it doesn't seem like higher ed has really been a large agenda item into itself at the national level. It hasn't been, beyond what we had with the Clinton and Bernie talking about free higher ed. That kind of has gone off the map now. It doesn't. Well, there's a movement here in California. I should note that, in a bill. But generally, there hasn't been an overarching agenda about higher ed. It's more like it's just a series of different things that fit into the Republican agenda in some form. So one thing I want to focus on is the visa side of it.
Could we have Bob talk about for-profits at some point? Because, of course, he was intimately involved with trying to regulate them and was very successful. And now Betsy DeVos seems to be reversing that. I'd love to hear his take on where we're going there.
Okay, you want to do that?
I'm sorry
and then
to
we'll talk
interrupt,
about
but
visas?
I
Go ahead.
Either way.
No, go ahead.
I just really want to know.
Sure, yeah. Some changes had been made during the Bush administration that basically were too much of an invitation for large corporate entities to just add hundreds of thousands of students, many of them online, low quality degrees, claimed they were leading people to jobs, was not really leading people to jobs. That all came to a head about at the beginning of the Obama administration when I was there. And we started a process of reimposing some regulation, some oversight, and over a number of years when I was there and then after I left, helped to kind of clamp down on and insert some measures that if you are training people for careers, but people are not getting the jobs to repay their loans, then at some point you're going to lose access to federal student loans. So some reforms like that. This administration, I was hopeful at the beginning. The first 6 months, I sat down with some of the Trump appointees, led them through the history of abuses after World War II in the 1970s. In the late 80s, there was Republican leadership in fighting predatory for-profit college problems in past decades. But starting in about June, this administration under our Secretary of Education just started reversing everything and has now started regulatory processes that pull back most of the important regulations that we put forward in the Obama administration. So it does seem like it is a new invitation to for-profits to enter the space, grab all the financial aid money without any real kind of accountability. And it's a faith that Betsy DeVos has in a market solution that if people are buying it, even if it's with a government voucher, if they are buying it, it must be quality. So raising quality questions don't work, because if they're buying it, it must be a good product.
So I just wanted to focus a little bit about really about talent mobility, and visas as part of that. California is a great example. We're a net importer of talent, and we really need that because we don't produce enough. Even if we were an ecosystem that can do that, produce its own talent for the tech industry and these kinds of things, we need talent to come in. And then you noted the numbers that are in graduate education in the STEM fields. So what's your kind of sense? One, there is the threat of new visa policies and restrictions on HB1 visas, for example. And then there's kind of the aura of what's going on in the United States. And is this a good place for talent to come from various parts of the world, whether it's from Europe or, let's say, a less economically developed area? Do you see any kind of things happening in the market for talent at a place like Berkeley, or where do you see? What are your concerns about the visa process or any of the politics surrounding that?
I would say that the biggest problem is we don't treat the visa project. People migrate as families. People don't migrate as individuals, and we don't treat them as families. So one of the biggest issues with H-1Bs before this plan now to not provide them to spouses is that they provided them to spouses, but then the spouses couldn't work. So you had a situation, if you had two educated people, one of them got a job here, the other wasn't allowed to actually exercise a career at all. And that is a big negative, both for the cost of living. Everybody knows living in the Bay Area is not cheap, and so only having one income is a big negative. But it just makes it's another level of stress. And so my partner happens to work for a startup in Silicon Valley that's British, and he is finding it very difficult to find engineers. And part of the issue, even to get the folks who work for his British headquarters to come to the United States, is they feel like the quality of their lives is not good here because it's just so difficult to get their loved ones to be able to be with them and to be able to then have a life here, which is what people want. And so I think it's a big issue, not only in terms of being able to get people the talent to be able to come, but to be able to have them then have a life that's sustainable and not have them leave.
There have been studies of who it is that brings the innovation technologically to California, and it shows overwhelmingly the importance of immigration. The first colloquium I attended in the College of Chemistry upon arriving in 1963 was given by a fellow named Andy Grove, who did a lot for California and came from Hungary as a refugee. The immigration is immensely important to the innovation for bringing in other viewpoints and just generally very smart and capable people. And my fear is one of image rather than facts. That is, it's exactly what you brought up, John, that enough will come onto the stage that scares people so that they will look at other alternatives. No, I think that's a major problem for California in particular.
And I do think this is a similar thing going on with Brexit and an unstable environment, and how will it affect the talent mobility that comes in, whether it's international students enrolling or whether it's postdocs or other kinds of things. So maybe, unless you have another comment, we'll go to the floor. Do we have a question out there? Yes, Marcelo. He's way down here. And I don't have to have a mic, so I can stand.
Hi. My question is about free speech. And all the discussion about free speech that happened here was about the political side. I would like to ask about the scientific or the scientific side that the university gives to some kind of event. Let's suppose that some kind of, not scientific event would be organized here at Berkeley. For example, let's say intelligent design conference. What would the administration of Berkeley do in that case?
That's
regarding free speech.
Right. I mean, if a student group wanted to bring a bunch of people here to discuss intelligent design, we would say that's fine. I don't think we would try to stop it in any way. I think it would be different if there were faculty members who were advocating intelligent design. I mean, that'd be more complicated. Would they get tenure? It seems unlikely. Judd may have better thoughts on that side of things.
I do not think their tenure chances would be influenced that much by what it is that they're working on. No,
I mean, there was a person, still is, I think, a person here on campus who claims that AIDS is not caused by the AIDS virus and has been very vocal about a completely different and alternative theory. And that person was, maybe still is, as I say, a tenured member, I think, of the biology department.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't think we want to interfere very much in those kinds of things. We really do believe in diverse perspectives, even if many of us think they're wrong.
Such a person is going to get judged by the system that reviews faculty members every 3 or 4 years for a merit increase, and this involves faculty committees on various levels, very objective. It is faculty, it's not administration, and then you get a recommendation for the advancement or against it from that system, and almost 100% of the time the administration agrees with what is recommended by the advancement system. So that sort of thing is the ability of a faculty member to thrive in their career and receive salary increases and so forth is very much governed by academic judgment of the collective faculty, not by administrative viewpoints and decisions.
Remember, it's a question.
Very basic one. The American universities were a path for social mobility in post-war era. Are they yet? Because these funding questions, how they play out in the rise of tuitions in California and in the other American states? It's a basic question. I really don't know about that.
Do they remain as much of an engine of social mobility as they were previously?
Yes, because of the increase in the tuitions. I mean, how the orange of the people, the social orange of the people that comes to the high education in the U.S. now.
So
because of this.
across UC, 40% of our students are eligible for Pell Grants. So we're one of the most, we have some of the largest numbers. I think that the thing people like to say is we have more Pell Grant recipients at Berkeley than the entire Ivy League combined.
Which is true of 5 UC campuses
That said,
individually.
I think something there's a lot of talk about social stratification in K-12. There's little talk about social stratification in higher education. And the reality is we don't have social mobility in the US in general like we used to. And so universities are not as much of that engine as they were previously. And so it is something to worry about. I'm not sure increasing tuition is part of it. I think the bigger piece is that a bigger chunk of what you're paying is now loans rather than grants. So if you had more support for poor students that wasn't things that they have to pay back later, if you start your life with $200,000 of debt, it's just much more difficult to get ahead. And so I think actually the lag is going to be later in people's lives because we now have 2 generations who now have graduated from college with this huge sort of albatross around their neck that precludes the ability to buy a house, that makes it difficult to live in places like the Bay Area. And so I think we have some long-term repercussions to the policy choices we've made in terms of changing the financial aid mix from Berkeley was $1,200 a year when I came here. And so it just makes it much more difficult to leave and be free of that financial burden.
And base tuition for in-state students is about $12,000 now, so that's 10 times what Lisa paid. Just some quick points. First, we don't do it alone in terms of having a large number of Pell Grant eligible students. We actually have in the state of California a thing called the Cal Grants program, which is very need-based, and that really, really helps bring low-income students into the University of California and into the Cal State University system, the next tier. And other states that don't have a program like that don't do anywhere near as well. So one of the really important things is to have a program like Cal Grants. The second thing is that I should note that the average debt for students graduating from Cal is more like $20,000, not anywhere near $200,000.
That's average debt for students who take on debt.
And that's for people who take on
That always
debt.
gets confused.
So we really do quite
50%.
well, and that's much better than the national average. So we actually do, again, partly through our own devices, but partly because of the Cal Grants, we do very well in California in that regard, and there are other states who do well and some that do badly.
There's another factor too, which is that all through these increases in tuition, from what was practically zero tuition, 1/3 of all increases have been put into need-based financial aid.
Right.
So
steady policy.
I will ask a question, and I hope you're waiting for another one. And I want to get to the fee waiver, taxing fee waivers for graduate students. I think, my sense is, and Henry, you're dealing with this all the time, is that we're kind of at a precarious point in terms of our ability to be competitive to get top graduate students. If that was to go through, and it kind of looks like it might have a shot. That, in other words, the technical aspect of this is in the tax proposal put forth in the House, I believe. Basically, it would say that when we provide waivers on the fees for graduate students, instead of just being a waiver, that would be taxed as income. And graduate students generally are not really super rich people, so this could have a really significant impact. But have you talked about this here locally?
Well, it would be a big problem for us. Interestingly enough, since our tuition, graduate students, when they come here, can, after a year, apply for in-state tuition. Once they get in-state tuition, it's about $12,000 or $13,000, as I said. And so actually the waiver they would get would be of that order, and therefore the tax burden wouldn't be that large. It'd be about $1,200 more dollars or so. Interestingly enough, it's the privates which have tuitions of $50,000 that they waive for students. Then the student would have to pay taxes on $50,000. That's going to be about 4 times more than what our students would have to pay. So interestingly enough, it could really hurt a lot of the privates more than it would hurt.
So it's a good thing for you, is that right?
No.
I'm not advocating for it. I'm just trying to say, here's the one good thing. I think, generally speaking, by the way, I think the tax code's a lousy way to subsidize higher education. I would love to do it more directly, and if we could make a deal with saying, yeah, well, that's fine, you tax that, but you make us whole, or better yet, give us even more money to give to students, I'd take that deal in a moment, but nobody's going to make that deal. The trouble is we're just going to lose this benefit, and the net result will be more costs for higher education across the board.
Because just to be clear, our stipends are significantly lower than the privates, and so our students already have a lot less money as a baseline. Private institutions do have the capacity, many of them, to make up that difference for their students. We don't have that flexibility at all. As it is, we find it difficult to compete with many of the privates because of where our stipends are now. So it would hurt us.
Okay, one last question.
Thank you.
It has to be a question.
Yes, my name is Kirson Song, College of Education, Judson University, mainland China. But I'm a visiting scholar in Graduate School of Education, UC Berkeley. This is it's a fundamental question. I just struggled myself for a long time. Like science and humanity, which one is more valuable? Or like cosmopolitanism and new nationalism, which one is more valuable? I just think about is what you think kind of money and knowledge in university. What did you more mind in our future university? What is our looking forward to? We have to more mind in our mind and keep forward establishing our university more, in fact, our society. This is my question.
Not sure I got your question.
Okay, so
Which is more vulnerable,
Which is more
humanities
vulnerable.
or science?
Your mind in your mind,
Right.
Because now it kind of a new nationalism era,
Right.
And if something changed, we show about a lot of negative phenomena. So what do you more mind in your mind?
Right.
Bring to your university, develop is money, or what is the value on there, or knowledge?
I don't think
That's a really complicated question. I mean, I think the sciences are protected by the fact that, as Judd said, congressional committees do actually have an understanding that if there's one thing maybe government should do, because it truly is a public good, is support science, and they understand that has implications for our economic competitiveness. So I think that money will continue to be forthcoming. And they also find science to be less bothersome from their perspective. The humanities they find to be very bothersome because there's a lot of people in the humanities and the social sciences who are going to be critical of some of the things that the Trump administration is doing. And then in between is climate science, by the way. That's an interesting story in and of itself. So there's some areas of even hard science that people in the Trump administration seem adamantly opposed to. Judd?
Yeah. And that I would agree with that. I would also add that the fate of climate science is pushing a huge burden forward on the world. If we do not succeed in bringing down emissions in this point of time, there's the 50-year lag associated with the buildup. We are pushing an ever-growing problem onto our children and grandchildren.
I mean, in the chemistry area, think if we could come up with a battery that was twice as efficient as the ones we had now, which I don't think is a crazy idea, and yet we're not putting money into developing that kind of technology, which could revolutionize how we store energy, which is one of the biggest problems we have, and give a greater range to cars and trucks now.
So I think we should conclude. I'll just only say that much is up in the air because we have two tax plans out of the House and the Senate. They don't still. There's also a budget act still to be had. So there's a proposal by both the Senate and the House, and they have to all this has to converge at some point, and it's still a long haul before we know. So we might not really have a sense of what's going to be the impact on higher ed until going into that next year of some sort. So we can only have our fingers crossed. So we now return in 15 minutes for the final session on China. Please stay with us.